Hey everybody, it's Curse, and today I wanted to bless you with my finalized 2 Hit Glacier Sorcerer build guide. Sorry it took so long, but I just felt like the build wasn't at its full potential and I thought that I could keep improving it. And so I did. I did quite a bit of min-maxing. I have made multiple upgrades relative to the previous version that I had. And as you can see, this build is capable of killing Aberroth. If you happen to have seen the Aberroth kill video that I just released, you're also aware of exactly how bad I am at dodging boss mechanics. But being bad at dodging boss mechanics forces me to min-max my builds even further, and that's okay. That's why we're here today. I'm very happy with the improvements that we've made, and I have something really special in the video as well for you. I kept getting asked about whether 2 Hit Glacier or 3 Hit Glacier is better. Now, I could just tell you that 2 Hit Glacier is better because I'm running it, and I'm totally biased. Or we could actually do a proper, thorough analysis. So I'll take you through the 3 Google Sheets that I put together to analyze and consider whether 2 Hit or 3 Hit Glacier is better. You'll see the conclusion that I came to. But bottom line is 2 Hit Glacier encourages you and requires you to stack a lot more mana. And that was one reason I went for it. I knew that stacking mana was something I wanted to do because I was eventually going to pivot towards Static Orb. And given that Glacier's greatest weakness is single target damage, including even Aberroth, and I say greatest weakness, but at the same time, Glacier is pretty solid against single target. So it's not like it's atrocious, it's just that we have options like Static Orb, which is one of the best single target one-shotting skills in the entire game. So having stacked so much mana enables us to easily transition into a Static Orb for a single target, together with some other skill for AoE and for clear hybrid build that we can run and just feel probably the smoothest out of all the other sorcerer builds. So given that this is a pure Glacier build guide, it is very possible that we arrived at some upgrade in the near future, a hybrid build of some sort that takes down bosses even faster while still retaining the great clear speed and tankiness of Glacier. But for today's video, let me walk you through all of the nuances and details of 2 Hit Glacier. Irashaimase! Alright, so unfortunately Last Epoch is down right now, so I'm gonna have to show you the build inside Last Epoch tools rather than inside the usual in-game interface, and that's fine. I actually have imported my build, the exact items, and you can see I've clicked actual. So this is exactly the stats that I have, and everything is matching 1-to-1. So let's start with the skills. As per usual, the most important skill, the main DPS of the build, and that's Glacier. In here I have my actual setup as of today. This is what I killed Aberroth with. And it's super basic. There's not much else you can do with the 21 points that we have. You remove your large explosion, get your cold snap maxed out, get the most multipliers for your middle explosion, and then get your mana recovery mechanism through critical rejuvenation, and then dump everything else into Mordida's Bane. If you want to see the exact skill progression, I'll have that included in the Aspirational build guide, and that's this tab right here. But for the actual, I'm just showcasing it as is today. If you were to move up with a couple of extra skill points because of Aberroth's Amulet, I would put 1 extra in Mordida's Bane, and then the last one in Breaking Point. Not much else to do. Afterwards, we have Teleport, a very basic setup. You want Comet Rush to be able to refresh your hastes that come from your Wrong Warp. And then a bit of armor, a bit of elemental affinity, and time dilation. Super straightforward. Ice Barrage is also fairly straightforward. You want to get Frost Armor. That is #1 priority for the more global cold damage of 60%. It's a significant DPS boost. Make sure to get it ASAP. And surprisingly, this is something that somebody on Twitch recommended for me. Ice Shield detonates on expiration. This is a hard freeze, and it's super useful versus Aberroth. Yeah, I strongly recommend this one. Try it out, especially if you're trying to do pinnacle boss fights. Even more so if you can time it to freeze him while he's doing his massive wind-up attack that forces you to move like a screen away. Otherwise, you just get some extra fire rates and then duration and even more fire res, extra damage, etc. For Flame Ward, again, nothing too crazy here. I'd recommend get your damage reduction maxed out, duration obviously, increase cold damage by the conversion, And then because we've gone through the cold conversion, we can actually get an extra 800 armor. So even more survivability when we activate Flame Ward. And finally, we have Arcane Ascendance. The most important notes here are the extra spell damage. The mana drain reduction is great. A little bit of haste doesn't hurt. If you have a source of slow, Chronoplasm is great as it is a 24% more damage. And finally, we have Power Overload as well as Unstable Energy. I'm trying these out. In theory, they're not going to give too much value because we can never stay in Arcane Ascendance for too long. The mana drain gets excessive, and we also need to be dodging enemy abilities. Most enemies are not going to survive that many hits of Glacier. It's only going to be useful versus bosses, and that is the primary use case for these. But I still keep 1 point in Superconductor for just applying extra ailments, Armor Shred, Cold Rest Shred, stuff like that. So this is the skill setup in the Aspirational Planner. So I don't have too many changes with regards to the skills relative to what I had prior to the patch dropping. So let's move on to items. And items is where I made a bunch of upgrades. For example, I do have Wrong Warp right now. This item is actually insane, both for DPS and survivability. Basically, we have close to a 2.5 second cooldown on our teleport. And even if you add a little bit of cast time, it means that we can cast teleport once every, let's say, 3 seconds, giving us a 1 second invulnerability every 3 seconds. And that is a 33% uptime on invulnerability. It's absolutely ridiculous. It also gives us 150 move speed, as you can see. It gives us cast speed, and 35% cast speed, by the way, is a tier 6 cast speed affix. 35% move speed is beyond a tier 7. On top of that, it gives us haste. It gives us spell damage per 1% increased move speed. So at 150, that is 450% increased spell damage. Guess what? That is 2 tier 7 affixes. So all of the affixes on this item, even if you don't count the legendary potential slams that we have, you're working with potentially 3 to 4 tier 7 affixes. And then on top of that, a 1 second, 33% uptime invulnerability. And then on top of that, the slams. It even has cooldown reduction on teleport, slows and freezes enemies around you. This item is absolutely insane. Better yet, it also happens to have the best implicits for a mana stacking build, and that's because it's a crystal wand. So I very much realized that I had been sleeping on this item. This item is phenomenal. As soon as I switched to one of these Wrong Warps with a solid tier 7 crit multi, my DPS increased by something like 60 to 80%. So very much strongly recommended. Something else that I realized as I was going through my previous build planner is that stacking mana in the weapon is inferior to getting crit multi. If you look at the rolls on a tier 7 mana affix in a weapon, it goes up to 120 on the wand, whereas crit multi goes up to 88. Now if we look at a relic, it also goes up to 120 mana. So it's the equivalent from a mana perspective, but a tier 7 crit multi is only up to 50%. So utilizing the wand for a tier 7 crit multi, and let's say a relic, an offhand, and a glove, and everything else for mana, you just get much more value per affix overall. A lot of the other affixes on the items are very similar. Mana here, mana int here, mana int here. On the Crystal Skull, I did switch to crit multi instead of cast speed. I do believe, and I checked the calculations in here, this tool actually works very nicely for Glacier. It gives you the DPS that you're going to get. And so I did check the exact DPS with crit multi versus cast speed. Crit multi is quite a bit better. The rings are the same. The boots, I prioritize move speed for the synergy with Wrong Warp so that we can actually get 153% MS. The int, while nice, I don't think it's as high of a priority as the move speed here. The Stormcarved Testament, I think I made a similar adjustment in prioritizing crit multi over cast speed. The Eternal Gauntlets, they don't spawn with crit multi, so I do believe cast speed is better than int. However, we still keep tier 7 mana. Now, this is your only source of armor shred, so you have to make sure to get armor shred on your gloves. Otherwise, your build is going to be quite a bit weaker. Hybrid armor is great to get that crit damage reduction, max stealth, but also just to stack armor. And you can see I'm getting up to 70%. Obviously, this is absolutely min-maxed and likely not going to happen in a real build. But still, this is phenomenal for a caster build. And finally, I did make an adjustment on the belt as well. And this is why. With this current setup, you're going to be generating 3 to 4,000 word per second, and anything over 4,000 word, as we know, because the word changes, you get much more diminishing returns by getting more word beyond that. So the word retention that we would have gotten from Strand of Souls isn't as valuable as getting the extra armor from Praetorian Belt, where you're essentially making the existing ward, even though it's slightly smaller numbers, capable of tanking much more damage because of the armor mitigation. So I highly recommend Praetorian Belt, and because we're not running Strand of Souls, we can afford a few extra affixes like CDR, like cold damage, and the incredibly valuable ailment cleanse on potion use. Playing without an ailment cleanse is very frustrating. I can guarantee you beyond 500 corruption, getting an ailment cleanse on potion use is a massive difference. Try to have it, and running an exalted belt makes it so much easier to get that ailment. So that's kind of it for the items. Now keep in mind all of these are aspirational. None of these are necessarily must-have core items. All of these are very high value though. So you want to just slowly work your way up. You know that I ran this build from level 1. I was running Glacier the entire time through the campaign and then getting all the way from level 100 to an Aberroth kill. So it's a very smooth progression, one item at a time. Getting up to that 2000 mana is a very significant breakpoint, which allows you to actually keep your mana topped up thanks to critical rejuvenation. So that is the point where this build shines the most, and you probably don't want to be fighting Aberroth too early, especially before you hit like 1900 to 2000 mana. I would not recommend it with this build. In terms of idols, I didn't really change anything. I'm just running the standard mana idols together with a Thorn of Ambition and mana cold res, little ones, and then blessings. Everything is the same relative to the previous build guide that I had. I'll quickly go over them. We go crit multi, max mana, all res, cold res shred, and then armor. I do believe these are best in slot, so I don't recommend any other choices, honestly. When it comes to passives, we don't have too many changes there as well. I kept the mage side of the skill tree the same. On the Sorc side, I did move Arcane Insight to Recollection. Now, the reason for that is 25% CDR is highly valuable for Wrong Warp because teleport cooldown and the lower that you can get it means the more uptime you have for invulnerability. More CDR, more invulnerability uptime. Otherwise, everything is pretty standard. Lost Knowledge is an insane source of ward, so make sure to play around it and consider how much current mana you have as you play through the game. It is very, very important to stay topped up on mana. The Rune Master side is not much different as well. So that's the setup for the build, and I didn't go into too much detail on many of them because I covered them recently in another build guide video. You can check out the other video as well. But the reason I'm trying to speed up the video a little bit is because I have a massive analysis here for you. Is 2 Hit Glacier better? Or is 3 Hit Glacier better? If you skip going into these 3 points and rather than maxing out the middle explosion, max out the top explosion, perhaps something like this. And so is this setup better or worse relative to the 2-hit setup? And I put together 3 different spreadsheets to analyze it from different perspectives. So the first one here is the leveling side. If you start with a super simple mage setup, just 5 points in here just to unlock Glacier, and then we can work with the Glacier skill tree, and the first point always goes here, and that's when things branch out depending on whether you want to do 2-hit or 3-hit Glacier. If you want to do 2-hit Glacier, you go this way, and if you're going for 3-hit Glacier, you add an additional point in Breaking Point. And the cool thing here is that last Epoch tools allows us to check out the DPS that we are going to get after every single point in Glacier. So I will save this order of skills in the description below so you can check out what I was doing. But basically, if you go for 2-hit Glacier, you can see at Glacier level 2, our DPS drops significantly, but our mana cost also drops significantly. So what ends up happening is, in terms of damage per mana, we are much more efficient compared to the 3-hit Glacier. We get 158% more damage per mana at this point in time. And then as we progress through the skill tree and we start acquiring these very high value points of moderate destruction, because moderate destruction gives you 35% per point, whereas greater destruction only gives you 20, you can see that 2-hit Glacier continually tries to catch up to the 3-hit Glacier because of the efficiency of those nodes. Obviously, just the DPS and the damage per mana metrics are not the only thing that matters. There are just so many other things to consider, like do you have a solid way to recover your mana? And if you do, then running 3-hit is not a problem. However, generally, when we run 3-hit, we have to run a mana generator, something like Mana Strike. The way it works out for 3-hit Glacier is you kind of cast it once, and then you're probably just hitting twice with Mana Strike to get your mana back. So net, it's a very similar result, especially if you're finding a very tanky boss. I think early on, they're probably performing similar. Against trash mobs, there are many things to consider. 3-hit might be overkilling them, whereas 2-hit might not be killing them in one shot, so you may need to be casting it twice. All in all, I think early on, it might be similar, especially once you get used to the 3-hit playstyle. However, if you are new to the game, I guarantee you, 2-hit Glacier is going to feel a lot easier to play. 3-hit Glacier requires very thoughtful mana management, whereas 2-hit Glacier is trivial for the first 50 to 60 levels in the game. So if you're new to the game, certainly go for 2-hit Glacier, because these early points, you are very much more efficient with every single mana point that you have. And you can see that as we go up in levels and as we invest in the Glacier skill tree, 2-hit catches up in terms of DPS to the 3-hit Glacier. Not only that, but it also gets more and more efficient in terms of mana. I should note that around this point is when I decided to go for the critical rejuvenation for 3-hit Glacier. It might be a little bit too early. You could probably get away with getting more damage first and then going for the critical rejuvenation. And that is why you can see when I'm going for critical rejuvenation on the 2-hit Glacier side, the 3-hit catches up a little bit, but it's still clearly inferior to 2-hit Glacier. I should, however, highlight that the greatest benefit of 3-hit Glacier is that it always takes advantage of Lost Knowledge. Lost Knowledge is probably the greatest defensive tool that Sorc has early on in the game, and even in the late game. It generates so much ward, and it makes it much less likely for you to die. However, it has that threshold of 40 mana cost. And as you can see, before this point in time, 2-hit Glacier costs 11 mana. Here it's 34 mana. That's still below 40. So below this point, you're actually not benefiting from Lost Knowledge. There's no point speccing into it. You probably want to spec into it as soon as you hit level 19 in your Glacier tree, or if you move around your skill nodes a little bit, you could probably spec into it a little bit earlier. But point is, you lack defenses significantly in the 2-hit Glacier setup relative to the 3-hit Glacier setup. So you're going to have more DPS, especially more sustained DPS, thanks to the mana efficiency that we have with 2-hit Glacier, but you will be quite a bit squishier because of that. So based on what I'm seeing here, I think between levels 40 to 65, 3-hit Glacier is going to have an easier time, and that's going to be around the time you're running monos likely to get to that campaign skip. So running monos is probably a little bit smoother for 3-hit Glacier because of that tankiness and survivability. However, you will have more DPS and better mana sustain with 2-hit Glacier. And obviously 3-hit Glacier has greater reach and greater AoE. So that is another reason why monos are going to be a little bit easier in this sort of level range. But the thing is, as soon as you hit 19 skill points and hopefully around 900 or so mana, 2-hit Glacier also costs 56 mana. Same thing as 3-hit Glacier. And then at this point in time, 2-hit Glacier is simply superior in every single way when it comes to DPS and mana efficiency. You just get 34% more damage, all else being equal. I'm assuming here no difference in itemization, obviously, and no difference in whatever else. And now we can talk a little bit more about getting close to the end game right here. Once you hit 20 skill points in your Glacier skill tree, you can see, 36% more damage from 2-hit Glacier. And it gets even more interesting if we put more points than 20. So in my example that I have right here, let's go back down to 20. And the way that I got to 24 is by just putting a very basic chest piece with +4 to Glacier. Now, obviously, in a real game scenario, you might be acquiring +1 in other skill slots or item slots. You might be running an Unstable Core or a Nihilist. I just wanted an easy way of getting a few extra skill points. And I have the exact same identical setup on both sides so that we're comparing apples to apples. And so when it comes to the 3-hit Glacier at 20 points, this is kind of what I'm expecting to see. And the issue that we run into here is that the tree is very saturated. You're pretty much maxed out at 20 points. Additional points add very little in terms of DPS. The greatest benefit is from breaking point. And then after that, you're just starting to stack up the middle explosion, or maybe you get more stun chance, or just some other utility. Stacking up the middle explosion gives you very little value, and you can amp it up even further by moving Cold Victory to something else that gives you more middle explosion damage. And so the point that I'm making here is that 3-hit Glacier does not benefit much in terms of damage when you go beyond 20 skill points. 2-hit Glacier, on the other hand, has 2 empty points in Mordida's Bane, which is a massive boost to DPS versus bosses. And then once we max that out, we even have 2 extra points for Breaking Point, which is mana efficiency as well as extra more damage. And that is why if we can push up Glacier from 20 to 24 skill points, 2-hit Glacier benefits more from that than 3-hit Glacier. However, the endgame is much more complex than this simple DPS analysis that I have. So I have a separate tab going deeper into endgame, both from a defensive standpoint and from trying to account for the fact that 2-hit Glacier, when min-maxed, requires probably maybe 2.5 thousand mana at least, whereas 3-hit Glacier requires around, let's say, 1,500 mana. So that 1,000 mana difference translates to different affixes that you can ramp up damage. And so the damage gap of 164% gets diminished significantly because of more affix options for the 3-hit Glacier. So now let me show you my ultimate endgame analysis of 2-hit versus 3-hit Glacier. I have 2 setups right here. So this is the 2-hit Glacier and a very similar itemization setup for 3-hit Glacier. I wanted to make sure that I'm comparing apples to apples as much as possible while taking advantage of the fact that 3-hit Glacier can lower their mana pool and can run higher int, making it easier to hit crit cap. And so we can switch one of the crit rings into a Jorah Star Dial. So these are all benefits of the 3-hit Glacier. The mana that you can see here is a bit on the high end, and that's because I itemize primarily around the average point. You'll notice that both planners, when you click max, they're way over capped on crit. So this one has like 124 and this one has 128. So both of them can consider switching one of the crit rings to something else that is probably higher value, higher damage. But for the purposes of this analysis, the average point is a much better representation of what you might be able to acquire in a regular game. So the average item setup is right here. You can see 2-hit versus 3-hit. And then the max absolute upper limit of itemization is right here. So when it comes to 2-hit Glacier, with average items, we get 2,348 mana. Here's a quick demonstration. I just click average and 2, 3, 4, 8, which translates to 783 ward per cast thanks to Lost Knowledge. That's our primary source of ward, so I'm not even going to consider other sources of ward. This translates to, thanks to a 3.9 cast per second, roughly 3,052 ward per second. And so given our int amount and our ward retention, if we plug those ward retention and ward per second numbers into Tunk Labs, we get a stable ward of 12,151. If we do the same with 3-hit Glacier, we get 10,325 stable ward. What that translates to is a stable ward that is about 18% higher. Now in reality, we have other ward sources, like for example, Mana Shell gives you ward per second per 10 max mana, and given that 2-hit Glacier runs higher max mana, that's also going to be a higher stable ward if you're not casting anything. So all in all, we can conclude that 2-hit Glacier is tankier. Next, we can also check out the DPS. Last Epoch Tools does all of those calculations for you. You can see 3.9 cast per second. We don't have a large explosion in the 2-hit Glacier example. Here's our crit multi. It's a bit on the low side, especially if you compare it to the 3-hit Glacier having 500% crit multi. I put quite a bit more emphasis on 3-hit Glacier's crit multi because it scales the build really well, and it's something that we are a little bit lacking on the 2-hit Glacier. And that difference from 380 to 500 crit multi is how 3-hit Glacier manages to catch up in DPS so much relative to how much weaker it is just on paper if you don't consider optimal itemization. Based on this setup that I have, and keep in mind that I'm not running every single buff possible, both of these have equivalent buffs, and I am not including the 33% uptime Jorah Stardial buff. Even if I could include it, I would probably divide the benefit by a third just because it has a 33% uptime. But this benefit likely almost closes this gap. So the DPS, I think, is very similar between the two. So in conclusion, both the DPS and the survivability is better for 2-hit Glacier when dealing with absolutely min-maxed items, but you're going to see the bigger benefit on the defensive side. We're actually generating 45% more ward per second. However, when you translate that to stable ward, the benefit diminishes to 18% because of the changes to ward decay. Even though we generate 45% more ward, that only translates to 18% more stable ward. But having greater ward generation also means that if you take a big hit, you're going to recover your ward much faster and you're going to be safer much faster. So either way, 2-hit Glacier is significantly tankier relative to 3-hit Glacier. The benefit that 3-hit Glacier has, on the other hand, is that it has greater reach. You don't need to be as close to enemies. Another benefit of 2-hit Glacier is that your biggest source of damage, your second hit, actually arrives much earlier compared to your third hit. So I'm sure there are many cases where by the time your third hit comes, you might be dead. So if you look at items being absolutely maxed out, and this is just a super unrealistic scenario, it's the same story. Stable ward diminishing returns are even more evident, and so you get only 16% more stable ward, and the damage is still 7% more. But what is really interesting here is that the gap between these two options is actually smaller than I thought it would be. They're very similar in terms of DPS because of the optionality in itemization that 3-hit gives you. And so the conclusion I came to when it comes to pros and cons for these two setups, I tried to summarize them right here. And I'm going to be sharing all of these links to this Google Sheet, to all of these various planners. I'll put them in the description of the video so you can check them out and think about it for yourself. Who knows, maybe I'm missing something in terms of pros on whatever side. Keep an eye out for those. So let's take a look at the pros and cons for each side. When it comes to leveling, 2-hit Glacier has a massive advantage when it comes to mana management. If you are a new player, mana management is non-trivial. So I would recommend you should be going for 2-hit Glacier. The game is going to be a lot easier. On the other hand, if you're a veteran or if you want to challenge yourself and work on your mana management, you can definitely consider 3-hit Glacier as an option. It has a great benefit between levels. I'm estimating here 40 and 65-ish in terms of survivability before 2-hit Glacier gets to that 40 mana cost threshold to activate Lost Knowledge. So this is a massive benefit in survivability. I cannot understate how significant Lost Knowledge is as a survivability tool for Sorc. So I'm definitely not looking to understate the benefits of 3-hit Glacier just because I like running 2-hit Glacier. If you're having trouble in this leveling range, you can consider moving things around so that you can get to that 50 mana cost a little bit earlier. Another survivability benefit of 3-hit Glacier is reach and kite. The third hit is massive. It covers a much larger area. You can reach enemies from almost off screen, and that is a survivability benefit. So if you're having issues surviving with 2-hit Glacier, 3-hit Glacier is definitely a decent option. When it comes to ultimate endgame itemization, 2-hit Glacier is superior to 3-hit Glacier. Once you get to that 1800 plus and even better 2500 or so mana, 2-hit Glacier is going to be king. And that is going to be true also on the DPS side. With proper itemization, 3-hit Glacier can close the DPS gap, I do believe. But you need to know what items to be looking out for. Another really important point to make here is that 2-hit Glacier is going to have a very hard time tackling the pinnacle boss in that 1000 to 1800 mana pool range. So this is the early late game, let's call it. You might be level 100 already, or you might be close to level 100, but you just don't have quite enough mana to sustain your Glacier as long as you'd like. So you end up maybe running around a lot, or being just extra careful with how you play, or maybe running a mana recovery tool. You just have to do something that is very awkward when it comes to fighting pinnacle bosses. So if you want to tackle pinnacle boss content or just spam harbingers in that mana range, you may want to consider switching to 3-hit Glacier temporarily until you get your mana pool high enough to go back to 2-hit Glacier. Because once you're level 100, switching between 2-hit and 3-hit is fairly trivial. It takes like 5 minutes to get those skill points back once you're corruption 300 plus. So yeah, if that is your objective, if you want to be tackling the pinnacle boss as early as possible, 3-hit Glacier is going to be the better option. However, if you're willing to be patient like I ended up being this season, 2-hit Glacier is going to deliver better endgame DPS, and once you take care of that mana management, you're going to have 2,000 to 2,500 mana, which is perfect for all the mana stacking Sorc build pivots that we want to make in the remainder of the season. So this is another hidden benefit that you don't realize if you're actually aiming for a 3-hit Glacier, because you're going to probably stop stacking mana around 1500 or so. And then the final pro that I have here is that 2-hit Glacier's damage arrives a little bit earlier because it comes on the 2nd hit rather than on the 3rd hit. So those are my thoughts on 2-hit versus 3-hit Glacier. If I could pick my ultimate setup, I would probably run 2-hit Glacier for the first 30 to 40 levels. Then I would magically switch into 3-hit Glacier from level, I don't know, 40 to 65. Then I would go back to 2-hit Glacier until maybe level 100 or so. And then depending on whether or not I had enough mana and I was lucky enough with my items, I would consider, do I want to do pinnacle boss kills and harbinger kills? If I did, I'll probably go back again to 3-hit Glacier until I get to the 2000 mana point, at which point I would go to 2-hit Glacier. So that is my analysis of 2-hit versus 3-hit Glacier. I hope you enjoyed it. As you can see, I put a lot of thought and analysis into this, and likely I still missed a few things here and there. Either way, I'd love to hear what you think about this topic, because I think it's an interesting one. I think both 3-hit and 2-hit have various benefits. So I had a lot of fun analyzing this one, I gotta say. But overall, my verdict for pure Glacier Sorc mana stacking for 2-hit purposes is that it's a phenomenal build. You can tackle the entire game, and you can see based on my current actual setup with my Sorc, I have a DPS here of 292,000. If I were to optimize that a bit more, and you can see this is running average items, I would bring it up to 513,000. Keep in mind that a massive chunk of that DPS boost is coming from running Throne of Ambition and assuming that we're fighting boss enemies. If I take out Throne of Ambition, this is actually 372k versus my 292k. So there isn't a big gap between my current build and this current setup. The biggest difference that you'll notice is in the armor. In my actual setup, I have 1700. In this one, I have 3000. And that translates to 16% more armor mitigation. That's a massive difference. So I definitely need to work on my armor, and the best way to do that is likely by replacing the belt and gloves. But otherwise, we're very much on the right track to min-maxing our DPS, and we just have a few small items to get, like crit multi on the Testament, tier 7 mana, tier 5 crit multi on the Crystal Skull, cast speed if possible instead of slow on the Wrong Warp, but likely this is not something I'm going to be targeting because this is a very solid Wrong Warp as is. And that's pretty much the end of the build guide. I'll leave you with Corruption 511 Monolith Clear so you can see how the build functions and what the clear speed looks like. And one last thing I wanted to go over is that people keep asking on Twitch, what is the best way to figure out what my crit chance is for Glacier? If you're running the exact same setup as me, where you have a 6% flat crit offhand, 2% crit in both rings, that means your base crit is 15%. However, Glacier adds another 8% base crit on top of that. So the easiest way to know what your actual crit is for Glacier is to just multiply the number that you see on your character info on the bottom left for spell critical strike chance. If you scale that up by times 23 divided by 15, that is your Glacier crit strike chance. And based on that math, if you have a 66% spell crit, you're going to be crit capped for Glacier. So that's what you want to aim for if you happen to have 15% base crit. If you have less base crit, you just alter the math a little bit. Let's say your base crit is 10, then you want to be multiplying by 18 and divided by 10. So I hope those little tricks help you to get to that crit cap point. You always want to be running max crit with Glacier because of critical rejuvenation, but also because of the damage scaling. It's just pretty much a must-have for the Glacier build. You do have some flexibility in the Mage passive tree, where you can move around passive points from the health mana node onto the crit chance crit multi passive node instead, if you happen to need up to 35% crit chance. And quite honestly, in the late game, the HP mana node isn't that useful, so you can certainly consider moving those points to crit chance and crit multi. And next up for me is a static orb pivot. The objective is going to be to have static orb as the main DPS source for single target, while trying to achieve smooth clear with a different skill that is going to be likely used more often in monos. We'll try a few different options and we'll see what works best. If you're curious what we're going to come up with, please join me on Twitch. I try to stream 4 or 5 plus nights a week. And otherwise, let me know if you enjoyed this video. Please like and subscribe if you did. Also, let me know if you think that I missed anything in my analysis for 3-hit versus 2-hit Glacier. And with that, take it easy and gochiso sama desha.